Κυρίες και κύριοι, καλησπέρα, καλώς ήρθατε. Νομίζω ότι ερχόμαστε όλοι με μια διάθεση να παρακολουθήσουμε, να συμμετάσχουμε σε μια πολύ ενδιαφέρουσα συζήτηση. Η αφορμή είναι δύο βιβλία που συναντιόνται. Το ένα έχει ήδη εκδοθεί, έχει κυκλοφορήσει, έχει διαβαστεί, έχει συζητηθεί. Είχα και εγώ το προνόμιο να πάρω μέρος στην παρουσίασή του. Είναι το βιβλίο του Ευάγγελου Βενιζέλου, «Εκδοχές Πολέμου 2009-2022». Το άλλο είναι ένα βιβλίο που είναι υπό έκδοση, αλλά υπάρχει ήδη στα χέρια μας ένα κόπι πρώιμο. Το βιβλίο του Charles Dallara, Euroshock, How the Largest Debt Restructuring in History Helped Save Greece and Preserve the Eurozone. Τα βιβλία συναντιόνται σε ένα κρίσιμο σημείο και σε μια κρίσιμη εποχή. Περιγράφουν από διαφορετικές οπτικές γωνίες την κρισιμότερη ίσως διαπραγμάτευση στην ιστορία της Ευρωζώνης. Την διαπραγμάτευση για την αναδιάρθρωση του ελληνικού χρέους, του
Eurozone, the negotiation about the restructuring of the Greek debt, the PSI and the OSI. These, what we have here, we are lucky enough to have those two people who found themselves on opposite sides of the table in order to negotiate with each other. And this is a huge opportunity, especially at this point in time. We are at almost the start of a new debate about the new fiscal rules of the European economy. We should understand what are the lessons that have been learned after all this adventure. Plus, we are just 19 days before the Greek election. We need to know what we have learned since then, what we should have learned, what are we about to lose in the new election cycle, etc., etc.
I'm addressing to you and say, I always said you that I enjoyed reading your book. And well, I didn't expect to enjoy reading it because I was prepared to read, to go through an austere book full of technicalities about how debt sustainability is calculated and how bonds are engineered into a haircut and things like that. But instead, it was a fascinating book. Sometimes it reads like a political thriller, full of suspense, and sometimes it reads like the adventures of 1010 in Greek Deadland. So, anyway, having you that at the time were on the opposite sides of the table, I would like to invite you to comment each other's books and the experience of working together. Να ζητήσω από τον πρόεδρο, τον Ευάγγελο Βενιζέλο, να αρχίσει.
So maybe I can ask Mr. Venizelos to start. Pavlos, thank you very much for accepting to moderate the debate, and I would also like very much both the the cycle of ideas as well as the Delphi Economic Forum as well as the Patakis editions for organizing this debate. I would like to present to you the main character of this meeting, who is Charles Dallara. Charles Dallara is a great lover of Greece, a true American whose knowledge of Europe is very deep. He is a cosmopolitan personality, and he is very well aware of Europe and what's happening here, not only in the field of economics, but also in the field of politics and culture. His assistance was critical in the restructuring of the Greek debt. This has been recorded in Greek economic history and in the history of Eurozone. He is someone who is really a big capital in this story. He first came to Greece in 1972 as a young officer of the US Navy. He knew Piraeus, Elefsis, Nea Smyrni, Greek men and women, I suppose, as well. And then he went on to work for many years at the US Treasury alongside famous Secretary Nicholas Bardi, whom we know because of the Brady Bonds and Brady Brand, who worked on the then Eastern Europe, Africa, and Asia economies, and for a number of years he moved to the IMF, who was deputy executive director and subsequently the executive director representing the US. And you should understand how many things he's familiar with: US Navy, the Treasury, the IMF, and he then moved on to the IIF, to the Institute of International Finance, where he became the managing director up until 2013. And his stay at IIF was culminated with the restructuring of the Greek debt. There was no other restructuring of that was so demanding. Please, Mr. Tsima says, may I interrupt? Can you give us idea of the order of magnitude? Well, as far as the PSI, the haircut, 50% of approximately of the then debt, that is 107 billion in nominal figures, but we should not only be discussing the PSI, the private sector involvement. This was a precondition for a much greater issue, which was had a longer duration, the OSI, the official sector involvement, which was the restructuring of our debt by our statutory, by institutional partners. This is still ongoing, and in 2016 it was calculated as approximately 50% of the then GDP. This is a figure that changing all the time, constantly changing. We need to calculate the debt at its present value in order to proceed. But let's calculate it in a simpler way. The cost of serving of the Greek debt was reduced in 2018 by approximately 60%. The annual burden was reduced by 60%, and we will be able to discuss all the figures. 5 years duration became 17. The average interest rate was lowered, and most of this is because of Charles. He was our main negotiator, partner in the negotiations. He has gone through all the Greek finance ministers. I was in the transition between George Papandreou and Loukas Papadimos. We have the honor of having two former prime ministers here with us, Kostas Simitis and Loukas Papadimos. We had Charles Dallara with us, as well as the current president of the BNP. The French banks had maintained a big exposure to the Greek debt. Other banks have removed themselves faster. So these four people, the two Greeks and the international banking sector representatives, were the center that we will be discussing the multi-level and asymmetric negotiation. A few words about this book, which you described as a thriller. You are right. This is Charles's book is a multi-level book. It's a full journal from the point of view of the international private sector, that is the banking sector. It is it honors Greece, Greek history, Greek culture, Greek political philosophy. Charles is very well versed in all of these, and he follows already since 2010. Since his first meeting with George Papandreou in Davos, he has been following all the events up until the end, that is, up until the haircut and the restructuring, that is, on the 8th of March 2012. And the final thriller, that is, the Eurogroup negotiations on the 12th of January 21st of February 2011, where there was Lukas Papadimos, myself, Giorgos Zanias, Petros Christodoulou, and all of us in a building in Brussels. We are doing the final version of this multi-level negotiation. And what comes out as a result of Charles Dallara's books, it is that it is the IIF, the private sector, the banking sector, that had grasped the need for this restructuring, which from a legal point of view was a voluntary restructuring, long before our institutional partners realized that that was the only solution. And this is the main difference between the so-called first memorandum and the second memorandum. The first and the second program are friends from the banks, Charles, etc., and the steering committee were negotiating in market conditions, and they had something to lose. Still, they were more willing at times than our institutional partners. But I will talk about it later. Thank you.
Well, but an honor, and it is to be with you tonight, my good friend Evangelos, and you, Pavlos, and a real pleasure to be back in Greece. I have, as you might understand, many different memories of my time here in Greece, going back, yes, all the way to 1972 when I landed here and lived here for a while as a young naval officer, when I first probably developed my affection and respect for this country and its people. Of course, during 2011 and 12, it was indeed a very difficult time. And you ask us what it was like to be on the opposite side, Pavlos. Well, first of all, let me just say that when I first met this gentleman to my left, I was a bit uncertain. Is he a minister of defense? Is there a minister of culture? Is he a minister of foreign affairs? Or is he a finance minister? And I had been accustomed to dealing with finance experts. What I learned quickly, however, is that indeed he became a finance expert, and he became a tremendous partner to Lucas Papademos, who has honored us with his presence here tonight. And I think it's important to recognize that during these negotiations, Pavlos, yes, there were times when Evangelos and I and others were on different sides of a position. But as the pressures built, as the markets pressed, as the strains surrounded the Greek people, it became increasingly clear that we were pursuing a common goal. And I felt that in working with Evangelos and working with Lucas, and I pay respect as well to their two colleagues who were here with us tonight, who this would have never happened without them, George Zanias Petros Christodoulou, who were the key professionals in the finance ministry supporting both of them. It became obvious, I think, to all of us that we had a common goal of saving the Greek economy, reforming it for future growth and dynamism and competitiveness, and stabilizing the Eurozone. I think it's so important to realize that while all of us here saw this largely as a Greek crisis, and Greece was the epicenter of this crisis, it was a full Eurozone-wide crisis. And had the Greek economy failed, it would have been a failure and, I am sure, unfortunately, an economic collapse for the entirety of the Eurozone. There was so much at stake here as we were grappling with the challenges. And as I look back, I don't think I could have had better partners. And I pay tribute as well to those who preceded Lucas and Evangelos in their positions. George Papandreou, George Papakonstantinou, both of whom made serious efforts, but in a context which at the time was full of uncertainty and lack of institutional preparedness. I think it's important to realize that we all know Greece was not fully prepared for this violent storm which surrounded this country. But we should also recognize that Europe was not prepared for this. The International Monetary Fund was not prepared for this. No institutions were, and this is partly why it took quite some time for a consensus to emerge around the need not only to reform the Greek economy, which Lucas and Evangelos led through a crucial, difficult period, but to eliminate so much of the Greek debt and to restructure the remaining part of it.
Was there really a tense moment in these negotiations where you, Lucas Papadimos, Evangelos Venizelos, really came close to a fight?
Well, I don't think any of us are men of fisticuffs, but there were certainly tense moments because we, in the private financial community, were fully committed to what had been agreed with Chancellor Merkel, with President Sarkozy, and with the entire Eurozone in late October of 2011, that the debt restructuring would be voluntary. Now, what does that really mean? It means it was never purely voluntary, let us be honest, but it was voluntary in quotation marks. It meant that it was fully negotiated, that the terms of it were fully negotiated. Because this is not only the legal right of the creditors and the debtor, but it was the obligation of all of us to find a solution that we could all live with. There were times when the pressures grew from different quarters for all of these aspects, all the details not to be fully negotiated. And I don't mean pressures from Lucas or Evangelos, pressures from markets, pressures from Berlin, even pressures from Washington. It was at those times when my concerns greatly deepened. But I always felt that there was mutual respect and recognition among the parties of the importance of this negotiated solution. And I always felt that ultimately that's where we would end up.
Okay.
Now,
Charles most certainly looks at this point of view from the point of view of the banks. And I have to say that their flexibility, their disposition, their being practical, all of that was huge, or else it would have been impossible for us to have this voluntary haircut of the Greek public debt from a legal point of view. Now, please pay attention to what was actually happening. That was the first time in history ever when we had to have this happen within the context of a monetary zone, a monetary area. So we proceeded with restructuring the debt of a member of the Eurozone. We were talking about the euro being the currency, meaning that we were restructuring sovereign debt without, in reality, having any sort of monetary sovereignty, because the sovereignty is in the hands of the European Central Bank. And we were doing so without actually even having some sort of fiscal sovereignty, because we had to enforce and abide by a very strong and strict fiscal adjustment program in order for us to slush the deficit. And of course we had to proceed with fiscal adjustments at the same point in time. So this experience, such a big debt in nominal, in absolute numbers, within the context of a monetary area that would impact the second biggest economy the world over, that would affect all the members of the Eurozone, i.e. the very entity of the European Union. This was unprecedented. This was a first for both the Eurozone and the banking sector, meaning the private sector, who actually knew how to do so much with Ecuador, with Bulgaria, with Argentina, with other countries, but not with this voluminous construct. This was a hybrid phenomenon that is the Eurozone. That's one thing. My second point is this. In my own book, the main figure, the main character is Wolfgang Schäuble. Without Schäuble, we couldn't have had any political agreement reached when we talk about negotiating with the European partners, when we talk about negotiating with the Eurogroup. In essence, in practice, we are talking about primarily and mostly negotiating with the German government, and are negotiating in essence with Wolfgang Schäuble. Now, what about the three critical points in time for the private sector, if you ask? I'm talking about my book. In my own book, I am referring to the fact that we had a meeting in Berlin a few days after I had been named at the ministry. There was the the Georgos Papandreou administration still, so this was a purely PASOK government. Rasmussen and Schäuble was there, me and Zanias were there. We then agreed we were going to intervene in the debt just as long as we had a change in the ECB. So we said we would do so much after Jean-Claude Trichet leaving and Mario Draghi taking over. And this is a point when we agreed upon this. This is a revelation, if you will, because the haircut and the restructuring were going to happen in two stages. We couldn't proceed with a colossal haircut that would happen just out in the blue, just at once. So we had to have a two-phase haircut, or rather, we're not going to do that. We're going to announce publicly that we're going to have a small haircut, and until we make it happen, then we're going to have the second, the biggest haircut. So we had this agreement. Pray forgive me for interjecting, but you and I was an observer, and I tend to think that I know everything. But then again, upon reading your book, and now by reading Charles Dallara's book, I realized that there are many critical things that I wasn't aware of. You were not supposed to know that much. This was a secret at the time, and it could have blown apart and up the whole of the Eurozone, the global economy, the European economy, the Greek economy, and that could have led to speculation. So we were obligated to keep this secret, to make sure we protect it. In reality, all of the government was not aware at that point in time. So we had to shoulder this secrecy burden, which was huge. But Wolfgang Schäuble, whatever he agreed upon, he delivered on what he promised, despite the turbulence, or the remember, on July the 21st, we were in Brussels, and that's where the first decision was made about 21% of a haircut. The banks were enthused at such prospects. 21% is very friendly. The banks were very ready and prepared to agree with that 21%. Fokion Karavias at that point in time was a leading figure for Eurobank. He was not the CEO at the time. He was in charge of drafting studies and reports. He was preparing the Atlas plan. That was a very nice plan, which eventually worked as a source of inspiration for other interventions that happened. And since that point in time, we were trying to discuss and see what the impact on the Greek banks would be. But Charles, who agreed with this 21% very nicely, and he was having a discussion with me We were having a teleconference for that matter, the two of us. I was actually in Skiathos for just one day. My break was just a weekend long. And during that break, long weekend in Skiathos, that weekend rather, we were having a teleconference in order for us to put in place whatever was necessary. What am I going to say? I mean, amongst others, we had to convince the Finns. Remember, the Finnish guarantee, excuse me, this is a Nobel Prize situation we're talking about. At any rate, I knew we were not going to stick to this 21%. I knew that this 21% would be much higher. Now, let me make a leap in time. On the 26th of October, we were in Brussels and we decided we're going to move for 50. From 21%, we jumped into 50%. A few days later, there's a change in government. Lucas becomes the prime minister, and then we continue this negotiation. We still are going on with this negotiation. I'm talking with Charles and Jacques Lumière about the terms and conditions and the interest rates and everything. It's creeping details I'm talking about. So let's take you to the 21st of February when everything was agreed upon after so much trouble and so much work. So we're talking about 50%, and all of a sudden at the dawn we are telling him, you know, it's not 50, it's 53.5 after all, 53.5, this is it, 53.5 in every 100 euros, so this is the haircut, 15% in the hand, so in cash or cash equivalent, so 15, that would be the money our partners would give us. This is the so-called sweetener, which we were using or taking advantage of in order to get this haircut, and 31.5% would be the new bonds, the post-PSI bonds, which is another big story I could talk about. You do realize at this point in time, I guess, how constructive, how creative, how positive the involvement of Charles and his team was, because in the absence of Charles and his team, we wouldn't have had the positive response of the private sector. That's one thing. And on the other hand, in order for us to get there, we had to negotiate from a political point of view, mostly with the Germans, but generally with our partners. We had to talk the Dutch into this. And these are the toughest points that I'm touching on. There was the IMF. Well, okay, the Europeans were going to pay, so the IMF was okay. And then there was this multi-layered and asymmetrical negotiation, because we're no technocrats ourselves. We had to explain ourselves, and we had to explain ourselves before the Hellenic Parliament, the political parties of Greece, the society, the indignant citizens, the social security funds, the bondholders, and I was a Minister of Finance, and then I eventually became the president of PASOK, and I was going to run for an election. We had to have some sort of correlation of powers and make sure there's still democracy in place. So we were faced with many other issues. This was not just a purely technical discussion we were having. This was very complicated discussion that we needed to have.
In his book, Charles Dallara makes a multitude of reference to ancient Greek literature, and during this discussion, one could remember that whoever reminded us of such old tragedies was ostracized from the city. But still, my initial question is this, and Charles Dallara describes it in his book as the starting point. The mere idea that the Greek debt would have to be restructured, and which was a damned idea both in Europe and around the world, and the way that we can overcome this anathema is described, and then a number of steps followed. So please, let's listen to your side of the story, Mr. Dallara.
As Evangelos has said, when the crisis first erupted in late 2009, early 2010, precipitated by the revelations of the extremely large fiscal deficit and the market reaction, which was very sharp and very definitive. No more financing for the Greek government. The only market-based financing at that point was coming from the Greek banks. And we have two distinguished members, three, and others, I'm sure, in the audience, leaders of the Greek banking community, who were somewhat trapped in this circular environment because they had little choice but continue to provide some financing for the Greek economy. At that point, No one, neither the IMF nor those of us at the Institute of International Finance, certainly not in Frankfurt or Brussels or Athens, could fully anticipate that it would be necessary to have a massive restructuring of the debt. But as time went on, and as the other crisis countries went through their difficult times, and it's important to remember that the deterioration in the Greek economy occurred, and the crisis in Greece occurred while Ireland was afire, Italy was afire, and Spain and Portugal were also struggling mightily. The IMF really had no concept that there would need to be a massive restructuring of the debt. And there was strong resistance to this in the European Central Bank, because the leadership of the ECB at the time, whom we all respected, Jean-Claude Trichet, could not contemplate a member of the Eurozone actually restructuring their debt. He considered it anathema. He considered it a violation of the fundamental principles. But as Greece proceeded with the adjustment program, Pavlos, in 2010, especially toward the end of the year, parliamentary resistance, public resistance to some of the difficult measures increased. For example, the IMF, as George and Petros will recall, had hugely ambitious privatization goals. They were not practical, not in the environment of Greece at that time. As that struggle unfolded, there was this event in Deauville where President Sarkozy and Chancellor Merkel took a rather fateful stroll along the waterfront. And this stroll along the waterfront produced a statement which, quite frankly, shocked the markets, because it was basically a signal to global creditors that if you come back in to Greece, or even if you just hang on to your Greek exposure, because at that point, many banks still had billions of exposure, you may well be in the barber's chair and receive a haircut. And this was a very cold shower to the private markets, and it began to stimulate in the thinking of many of us that if we could find a way for an orderly, negotiated restructuring, which would actually reduce the burden of the Greek debt on the Greek people, on the Greek economy, and if this could be done in a cooperative fashion, that this could create some new energy for the future of the Greek economy. I had been heavily involved in the so-called Brady Plan, referred to by Evangelos. And the Brady Plan was brilliantly conceived by my boss, Nicholas F. Brady, the Treasury Secretary at the time, as a way of fundamentally altering the outlook for the Latin American economies in 1989. This is ancient history, but I could see in my own experience, because I was very involved in shaping and implementing that plan, that if we could do something broadly similar and broadly powerful, that it could create a new window of opportunities for Greece, especially if combined with commitments on fundamental economic reform. We began to discuss this among the private creditors, and this was in the spring of early part of 2011. The IMF was still very reluctant. The leadership in Greece was still very uncertain at the time. Prime Minister Papandreou and his team were very uncertain, I think, even though I know they were thinking about this as well. And as we proceeded in 2011, the pressures in the markets began to grow more and more sharply. Some of us concluded in the private financial community that there had to be a massive restructuring. However, the ECB was still extremely reluctant, and the discussions became difficult. And so finally, I called Trichet on one day, and I said, Jean-Claude, please, can we not initiate talks for a restructuring? His response to me was very firm. He said, Charles, you know my position well, which meant he did not support this, but please feel free to talk to the governments. And so I spoke with Jean-Claude Juncker, who directed me to go to the Italian deputy finance minister who was in charge of the Eurogroup. Maybe in European circles this does not seem so strange, but to me, of course, Italy was in the middle of a crisis as well. So to expect the deputy finance minister of Italy to focus on the future of Greece was a bit too much to expect. Nevertheless, the process began to unfold, and we began to proceed down this path of what did turn out eventually to be the largest restructuring in history.
Να πούμε αυτά τα δύο ονόματα, να τα σημειώσουμε, αυτά που είπε ο...
Let us note those two names. Vittorio Grilli, who was the Italian deputy minister, who was chairing the Euro working group, and up until Thomas Wieser became the permanent, not by rotation, chairman. And that was the level for at which George Zanias and Christodoulou were working, and this is brilliantly described by Charles in his book. He has the full minutes of all of these negotiations. But what was happening at that time? The Eurozone, or rather Europe, had decided that this was the end of history. The Maastricht Treaty of 1992 declares that we have reached the end of history. From then on, everything was supposed to move smoothly under normal pressure and temperature conditions. Lisbon, which is the treaty that is now valid, forbids us from all the saving salvage interventions for Greece. So we need to convince European governments, especially Germany and the ECB, that it is possible to proceed with a haircut inside the Eurozone, to make it possible, to make it acceptable by the private sector creditors, and for this to be acceptable in Greece, where the haircut had become a threat, despite the fact that it was a measure that would save us. We exist because of that, because of the 2012 debt intervention, because of the programs reforms, that is the liberation of the labor market, the opening up of the different professions, the reform of the retirement age, and finally, because of the chance we had with the inflation. If this hadn't happened with inflation, things wouldn't have been so good from the fiscal point of view. But we can say that there are three pillars. One is the debt intervention. Second, the harsh reforms which wouldn't have happened without the program, and which is a huge acquis. And the conjectural, the pillar is inflation, which brings about good results, but of course reduces the income of most of the members of society. Going back to history, last detail. Still two questions still remain. First of all, at the start, the fear was that the creditors wouldn't agree to a haircut, or that they would react to the amount of the haircut. What convinced them? What made them agree? And second, the idea that if there was what stopped the domino effect with the other overdebted countries?
Question, what convinced the creditors which, to be honest, I still don't have a complete answer for, because as I think back to it, I think no creditor wants to write off assets. No creditor wants to wipe out 3 months, completely 3 months worth of earnings, which is what it was for some of these banks. But I gained a growing sense that most of these creditor institutions, and this even included, of course, painfully, the leaders of the Greek banks and the Greek pension funds, most of them were men, and in some cases women, senior executives of these banks, deeply committed to the concept and reality of Europe. And Europe is and was a partnership, and the Eurozone was seen as a particularly precious jewel in the partnership of the entirety of Europe. And I think the fact that none of these bankers wanted their legacy to be one of having brought down the collapse, not just of the Greek economy, but of the Eurozone, had a lasting effect on their attitudes. I have to say, I was surprised. I would call them back time and again and say, look, I don't think, yes, we had the 21% agreement. It was July 21, so 21% sounded convenient, right? I don't mean to make light of it, but it was probably never a very sustainable reduction in the Greek debt. But when I call them back to say, look, gentlemen, we're going to have to move to 30 to 40, maybe even 50%, they would grumble, they would resist, but eventually they would come around. And I think a lot of it had to do with their deep commitment to the concept of Europe, to the future of the Eurozone, but also bringing it closer to their own balance sheets, to the reality that if Greece were forced out of the Eurozone, Italy could be right behind it. And for every bank that had €1 exposure to Greece, many of them had €3 or €4 exposure to Italy. So, these European bankers, they made massive mistakes during the period 2000 to 2009. They believed in the concept that if there's any problem in Greece, Germany will be there somehow, some way. And they were attracted by the returns of investing in Greek bonds. Even though those returns declined steadily during that decade, because Greek was a country perceived of growing creditworthiness during that decade of time. Notwithstanding the fact that particularly during those last few years of that decade, Greece's fiscal position was clearly deteriorating. Greece's competitiveness was clearly deteriorating. But these bankers had become accustomed to, unfortunately, living and recognizing the reality of their mistakes. I think that this risk of Italy also being pulled asunder and the visualization of a Eurozone that was ripped apart because of greedy bankers was not one that they were prepared to live with. Pavlos, you asked earlier what were some of the most frightening moments. And the more I think about it, it was not dealing with Lucas, with Evangelos. It was more dealing with some of our Northern European partners who actually began to convince themselves that they could force Greece out of the Eurozone without severe damage. That was a pure hallucination, If Greece had been forced out, and thank God Greece had the stamina, the fortitude, to remain in and to take those difficult measures, it would have not been just a huge setback for the people of Greece and the Greek economy. It would have been a huge setback for the entirety of the Eurozone and therefore for the entirety of Europe. When I read the statements, and sometimes I heard the statements, and I won't name individuals who spoke very casually about Grexit, I thought, how short-sighted this is. History will demand a very severe price if this happens. And I think, fortunately, you know, despite the mistakes that we all made, and I believe, with all respect to Lucas's predecessor, that the proposal for a referendum was a mistake. Despite those mistakes, you know, the Greek gods still must be there because they found a new leader for this country, and he only served 7, 8 months. But he, working with Evangelos, Lucas pulled together a cabinet and a parliamentary team around him that made significant progress on reforms, negotiated the restructuring, and gave Greece a fresh light and a fresh day. And I think that, unfortunately, the benefits of that restructuring were postponed many years by some of the subsequent turmoil in Greece. But now we're beginning to see this, because it wasn't just the elimination of $107 billion, which at the time, by the way, was equal to half of the GDP of the Greek economy. But it was also the fact that we took the remainder of all the debt owed to the private creditors, 100 billion more or less, I think, that's the number, and we stretched it out for 30 years. We said no principal repayment over 10 years. Take another 20 years to pay it back, and here are the concessional interest rates. Now, Lucas, Evangelos, his team, they negotiated hard on those interest rates. We gave a lot of ground. But in the end, we knew that, look, the banks were going to have to pay a price, particularly these Western banks. They deserved it, to be honest with you. You know, I mean, would never argue that the Greek banks deserved to pay the price they did. They were caught in the system that, unfortunately, came down around them and had actually managed, the Greek banks had actually managed their risk leading up to this crisis much better than the Western banks or the Western creditors. But I would like to add one further thought, if I may, and that is on this book here of Evangelos. I'm glad you said mine was a thriller. This book is absolute pleasure to read. I love the title. I think it's something like Going to War, because, and it's very interesting that he left the Secretary of Defense to go to war, because it was a battle at times. And there's some phrases in here which perfectly capture the reality of the moment. There's one phrase where he said, when Greece entered into this crisis, Greece was not just turning a page in its history, it was turning a whole new chapter, and it did. It entered into a cauldron of pressures, not just on the Greek government, but on the Greek people. But I am so admiring of the fortitude of the Greek people during this past decade, when they held on to the threads of democracy. Yes, it was stretched thin by what happened, but they did, and now we begin to see the fruits of these labors, the fruits of the reforms, the fruits of the debt restructuring. It took quite a while, so that painful chapter is now over. And I think we are in a new chapter of renewed growth, renewed dynamism, and perhaps a more sustained chapter than this country has seen in many, many years.
Θα συνεχίσω την πολύ ωραία ανάλυση του Charles
will continue the great analysis of Charles. He sees us in a very friendly way, on a very optimistic note, and he, of course, understands and highlights the sacrifices that the Greek people made, and the sacrifices were huge. I have to say that once our partners realized there's no Grexit solution on the table, and since we averted in any such scenario materializing before the year 2015, I mean, that we had to come up with a solution which obviously had to depend on debt restructuring. Couldn't be helped. There couldn't have been any other way. They helped us. But they helped us while being in the mood which was often a punishing one. They were penalizing us on occasion. They were acting as pedagogists. They were dealing with us that way. On the other hand, we definitely had to do something about the competitiveness of the Greek economy. In 2009, we didn't just have a primary deficit and a fiscal deficit. It wasn't just impossible for us to fund our debt. We had a colossal current accounts deficit at that point in time. The Greek economy was no longer competitive in 2009. Let me open up a parenthesis. In the year 2022, the current accounts deficit is 9.8. I mean, this is also because there's a war, there's an energy crisis, but even if we agree with the Bank of Greece estimates and the Ministry's estimate, even if we had a 6.5 in 2023, which is the good scenario, again, this is no negligible deficit. We're talking about current accounts, so we're talking about competitiveness still. Having said that, Greece became a lab. It was Hellas the lab for experiments. And we now have given to the Eurozone a huge key. Let me explain what sort of a key we gave the Eurozone. In the absence of Greece, Europe couldn't have been able to deal with the pandemic. It couldn't have been able to cope with the energy crisis. And I'm just giving you the titles, if you will. We had the revision of the very Lisbon Treaty, and interventions were allowed for. The idea of debt restructuring was eventually adopted and embraced by the Eurozone, which was against it in the first place. Wolfgang Schäuble, when we agreed on the haircut in July 2011, used to tell me or told me, Evangelos, we are jurists, we understand each other, we do understand one another, so you have to bring to the parliament the CACs, the collective action clauses. These were clauses that were not there in our bonds, but they were there in the Anglo-Saxon law bonds. So the bondholders of each issuance can make a group, a team, which will by majority decide whether they agree with the restructuring or not. Now, after the new stability pact, one of the fundamental keys of the Eurozone is actually the CACs, the CACs. And I'm not talking about simple CACs. I'm not just talking about the fact that each bond or bill has its own bondholders group. Each and every one on a national level can make their own team. So we are talking about advanced CACs now. That's another key. In addition to that, there was the QE, quantitative easing. The famous quantitative easing did not begin after the crisis. There was the OMT first during the crisis. The OMT was a program for countries in crisis, which is never used, but it's used as to exert pressure in the market. And this ushers in the QE idea as a notion. QE means that countries can issue bonds, and in reality, the European Central Bank appears to buy everything in the secondary market, although in reality, this is a primary market. This is what the German constitutional law said, but the ruling was not was not accepted, or it did not become generalized, because then we had the pandemic QE program, and so there was some sort of easing. Now, in reality, Eurobonds, which we were talking about here in Greece, and often people here would see as an extreme expression of populism, eventually they were adopted and embraced. The RRF counts on a common debt, common borrowing. In reality, it's based on some sort of focused Eurobonds. And now this is an idea which has become accepted. Moreover, we've had the ESM. It happened. It wasn't there before. And most certainly there was a change in perception as concerns what normalcy is all about and what a crisis is. Now Europe knows what a crisis is, and this is a colossal contribution to the Eurozone, so it's really helpful. But it was costly, says Mr. Zimas. Well, Mr. Venizelos says now the Eurozone has all that, meaning that thanks to Greece, the Eurozone has this key, and the Eurozone remembers and it takes advantage and uses this key. Greece tends to forget about its own acquis, and it downplays on its acquis, which it got through the crisis. Greece seems to think, oh, well, it's past us, so it's gone, and it's never coming back. Everybody tends to think that we are dealing with some sort of normalcy. But then again, suffice it for someone like Yannis Varoufakis to say, you know what, we could do this and that, and then all of a sudden everyone says, oops, we could possibly have new MOUs, or we could be thrown out of the Eurozone. But you know what, it's either this or that. We're either stable, we're either in a state of normality and regularity, and we're respectful of our acquis and we protect it, or it's the other way around. Everything is fragile, everything is borderline, and we have to be careful. I believe that the acquis is huge. I believe that Greece can be a solid and not a fragile economy and a state that's strong, but we should not forget about what happened, and we should not forget about what Saul said. He referred to Deauville. Deauville is what, you see? It's a statement by Sarkozy and Merkel, a statement to the markets, and they said something simple. They said you will evaluate each and every member of the Eurozone on the basis of their individual features and characteristics, on the basis of their macroeconomic, fiscal, competitiveness features and yields. You're not going to assess the whole of the Eurozone as one single thing. The bad guys are not going to hide behind the good guys, or this is what got Greece on the verge of a crevice, but this can be done at any point in time for a set of political reasons. In other countries in Europe, the electorates exert pressures in that direction, it's societies that exert pressure, so Greece should not just be simply one of the followers or of the end members of the Eurozone, and Greece should not be exposed as a fragile and a very sensitive country. In each and every crisis we have to achieve so much, and in my point of view this is a real agenda behind the upcoming election. In reality, or rather this is not the agenda of the electoral process, but it has to be a post-electoral agenda to a certain extent. But should we wish to have a nationwide agenda, a national agenda with lots of consensus, political and social ones, then we have to have a discussion about such issues. We have to discuss, of course, the economy and the function of the institutions and foreign policy. 3 big chapters, not 10 things. Thank you. Now, since you refer to Deauville, you know what? Deauville, to us and for us, used to be just one coastline, coastal area, a nice city, and all of a sudden it became synonymous with a disaster because we were faced with a big adventure. After Deauville, I just happened to make a trip to Dublin. You know what? You should have been there. Because of Deauville, the Irish entered a memorandum, and they wouldn't have had prior to that. 3 days after Deauville, the Irish had to ask for help. At any rate, Mr. Dallara.
Έδωσε πολύ χαρακτηριστικά και αναλυτικά μια εικόνα του.
Mr. Venizelos described very clearly how this changed the Eurozone. So, since you have first-hand experience, did the IMF change because of that? Because you describe it very clearly and you describe it very well. The fact that IMF was badly prepared for such a thing.
Let's hope, Pavlos, that we all learn lessons from this painful experience, because that is the benefit of history. If we study it, if we reflect upon it, what did we do right? What did we do wrong? Certainly we in the private sector made huge risk management mistakes during that first decade of this century. There's no doubt about it. We took for granted things about the Greek economy that we should not have. And I believe that risk management now in the banking community is better than it was at that time. The Troika made mistakes, and I believe that some lessons have been learned. It's not entirely clear to me, however. During the negotiations, especially in 2011 and early 2012, the Troika was constantly insisting upon more and more fiscal adjustment, even though this was patently not working. And of course, the need for structural reform by Greece was very obvious. But the efforts to kind of push Greece into more taxes, more spending cuts at a time when the economy was already contracting, proved to be very misguided. To their credit, the IMF has now acknowledged this. But still, it is not clear to me if there were a crisis again in a Eurozone country, and I don't mean to predict it at all, would the IMF have learned its lessons in how to deal with it and how to work more smoothly with Brussels, how to work more smoothly with Frankfurt, with his own Euro partners? I look at the Greek economy today, though, and I believe that some of those lessons have been learned. The lessons of poor fiscal management, which we saw, which contributed to the crisis, the lessons of lack of structural reform, the need for a more efficient civil service, and the need for a more competitive society. Of course, those problems have not been fully solved, but now I see momentum, and it's leading to greater encouragement, greater hope, greater confidence, and greater sentiment in the markets, which can permeate the sentiment on the streets. Now, we're no longer looking at unemployment that is close to 30% as it was during the height of the crisis, but unemployment that is close to 10%. Of course, these challenges are not yet resolved, but I do think that, that Greece has made huge strides. I also would underscore the importance of the Northern European members of the Eurozone and learning some lessons. One of the lessons has to be that the Eurozone and the entirety of the European Union is a precious partnership. There is no room for cultural or national arrogance. There is no room for condescending attitudes. Every economy is different. Every culture is different. It is only through the collective strength of the Eurozone that it can be a major player in the global economy. And I think that some of the partners of Greece lost sight of that, perhaps for short-term political reasons, I don't know. And I think it's very important. We've seen the solidarity of Europe in dealing with COVID and in dealing with this Russian invasion of Ukraine. Now that solidarity needs to be extended much more definitively in the economic sphere. There's still talk about a banking union, which never seems to happen. There's still talk about a fiscal union, which doesn't seem to be making a lot of progress. I think that Europe can take the seeds of solidarity, which they have created in these last 2 to 3 years, and extend it more definitively in the economic and financial sphere.
Έχουμε ήδη μεταφέρει τη συζήτηση στο σήμερα.
So, since we started discussing the present, in his last chapter, Mr. Dallara's book has under the title that you cannot enter the same river twice, because neither the river nor you are going to be the same. Still, how can we protect ourselves in order to better deal with a similar situation? I have a question which pops to mind in all of our minds, especially when we go back to this whole drama of debt restructuring and crisis. All the effort for the debt restructuring, which you just described, offers us a window, some time, up until the 5 billion that we now pay in order to service our debt become 15. So we are in a protected environment for a while until we change what needs to be changed, so that when we are left without this protection, to avoid falling into the same situation. So my question to both of you is, in your view, are we actually doing it? Are we actually using this unique window of opportunity? Well, says Venizelos, let's understand this window of opportunity. Up until 2032, we are in a grace, going through a grace period. We are only paying interest. In 2032, we will have to deal with a completely different situation. It's 9 years. Is it a lot? It's nothing. It's just a moment. On the other hand, we are very happy because due to the high nominal rise of our GDP, which is mostly due to inflation, the so-called depiction of our debt as a fraction of our GDP, as a rate of our GDP, has gone down by a lot. Is less than 160. That is the estimate for the current year. Everybody is happy. That was a miracle. And suddenly everyone understands that debt is an entity that is not going to be repaid. You refinance it, you service it, and you expect that its depiction will improve either by growth or because of inflation. The Greek debt is viable, sustainable, for specific reasons. First of all, because we have reduced the cost of servicing it, and because of the grace period. And secondly, because even as we speak, 76% of the Greek debt is not in the market, is in the hands of institutional creditors. In 2012, at the moment of the restructuring, the situation was the reverse. The 76% was in the hands of the private sector, and the remaining in the hands of institutional creditors. So this is a hybrid debt, and we need to deal with the following. We will gradually see the officials, the sector participation being reduced, and we will be exposed to the markets. We are waiting we are in view of the end of the grace period. So in fact, what we need to do is we need to refresh the restructuring through the OSI again. This time, this is not going to be offered to us by the market. We will not start with a PSI and then proceed to the OSI, but we will get it because of the good old OSI dynamic of 2012. Which was functional even during the Syriza period. But on the other hand, the so-called investment grade is a very important objective. Country needs to reach this investment grade. This will help the economy, Greek firms, investors who will be able to come here without a problem. So this is important. This has to become a national objective. But let us not forget that in 2009, before the programs, before the memoranda, Greece was 5 levels higher than investment rate, and then it immediately collapsed and we became junk, while the public debt was, if I'm not mistaken, 129% of the GDP, which was much lower, much less than the triumph that we are experiencing now, which is the triumph of the restructuring and of inflation. So we need to be modest, we need to be forward-looking, we need to achieve consensus, which we do, because initially we were alone. I mean, PASOK was on its own. And on the other side, we have the indignants of the upper and lower square. And since my proposal about voting for the first memorandum to pass with 120 votes, so that people can would assume their responsibility, we had to move with Loukas and with the George Karatzaferis's party. Then Syriza went through this 6-month period with a huge national risk, and then they started with the third memorandum, which could have been avoided if we had done well with the second one. And this is now a systemic power, conventional power, agreeing with Eurozone, Europe, NATO, the partnership agreement with the US. I have repeated this in an event organized here, and very rightly so. The Communist Party of Greece has taken this, what I said, this statement, and they said, yes, we are on our own, they say, and everybody else is on the other side. They are right to say so, but let us understand that it is a very good thing to have a range of systemic political parties, pro-European political parties, which all agree on these premises, the strategically important premises, because in order to be able to discuss things on different terms, which we don't do, it is as if we are hiding our huge national advantage, as if we feel guilty about it. In my view, the political system is looking backwards somehow, and not into the future. They do not wish to forget about the crisis and proceed into the future. In my view, this is something that I need to tell all the political parties, to address them and tell them that after the election, when everything about the elections will have been resolved, the first, second, third even election, then they have to look forward. And of course, if people insist that only a one-party government will be a solution, we may proceed into a third election. But I must say this is a problem. I am always concerned about the relationship between democracy with history. Democracy is something that happens every time we have election, but history judges you. Yes, let me translate what you've just said. We have a body of political parties that can agree, that have a consensus, but they are shy of admitting it. In the end, it'll be just you and me.
You, Pavlos, and I'm sure all of you will understand why I will completely refrain from speaking about the Greek political system. But you asked the question, is Greece doing the right thing to inoculate this country from future crises? And a couple of thoughts on this. First of all, I think that much of what I have seen recently is quite encouraging on the economic front, and I think that current discussion about Greece potentially being upgraded to investment grade is indicative of the improved investment environment. My own company, which is a Swiss-based private equity firm, Partners Group, made the decision well over a year ago to invest $1 billion in one Greek pharmaceutical firm. We already consider Greece investable, and this has already proven to be quite a successful investment for us. But I acknowledge that the decision, prospective, yes, of the rating agencies to upgrade Greece further is another potential sign, if it happens, of the progress Greece has made. But there is no room for relaxation in this constant effort to create a more competitive economy, to create a framework which encourages investment, both domestic and foreign, to create an environment which does not hinder entrepreneurs, innovators, but actually encourages them and facilitates them. There is still considerable room to go on this front, to create a public service which really is designed to be meritocratic, efficient, and focused on serving the people of Greece. I have seen the progress made here, but I think that, you know, without trying to be so prophetic, many of the reforms which Greece is pursuing and has pursued, and some dating back to the period when you two were leading the government, are generational reforms. They're not 4-year reforms. They're not 8-year reforms. They're generational reforms. And many of them depend upon a realization, not just by the political leaders, but by the Greek people, in my view, that there has to be a choice made. Do you want a government which hires 3 of your cousins, and the cousins who will then do you favors? Or do you want a government that is efficient, that is lean, that is competent, that is highly professional? Every democracy struggles with these issues, including my own, so I don't mean to point fingers just at Greece. But I think Greece has struggled more than some in finding that right role for the government, and I think that the progress which has been achieved is very encouraging. But there's so much more can be done because the potential of the Greek economy has still not been fully unleashed. When I look at the educated population that you have, when I look at the assets that you have in tourism, in energy, in pharmacy, and so many sectors and parts of agriculture, I look at an economy that is still not realized its full potential, and it's a competitive world out there. You know, Greece is competing for capital with every other country in the world, right? And so I think a sense of the rigor of the competition and a commitment to intensify some of these reforms will be the best inoculation for the future of the Greek people, so they will never have to suffer through this horrific period like the last decade.
I think we could go on, but we need to sit back, stop here, have the rest of the evening to ponder what we heard and what you do. Σας ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ για τη συζήτηση αυτή.
Thank you very much for this discussion. This was a privilege for us all. It was a very interesting discussion. Thank you for your attention.